Let me tell y'all a story about the humble little Rhino. Back in high school, after a long stint with my Necrons, I decided to put together a Space Marine army, and I found a bit seller online where I could get a Rhino chassis, a naked Rhino chassis, for like 12 bucks. This was an incredible deal, and so that led to me getting a little fleet of 6 of these guys. And this was 6th edition 40k, when transports were a much bigger deal. Boards were 4 foot by 6 foot, and everything in the game moved 6 inches. Although missing the bells and whistles, these guys got me through many a game of 40k, and they have been with me almost since the very beginning. Now I've got repulsors and impulsors to transport my Space Marines, so I don't use the humble little Rhino very much, but I don't intend to part with these partially built tanks. Instead, I think they're gonna shift from one of my oldest armies, Space Marines, into one of my newest armies, the Death Guard. My Death Guard army is rapidly nearing completion and in some desperate need of vehicles. Why go out and get some new Rhinos when I got, maybe not perfectly good, but serviceable Rhinos at home? I have my naked Rhino, I have all my Death Guard and Chaos Space Marine bits to pull from, and I have some fun old models to use to tackle this project. Retro Plastic Plague Marines. This Rhino has been with me for a long time, and it has the old Black Templar vehicle upgrades. These even have Black Templar symbols on the inside you'll never see. I carefully snapped these off, and for the top doors, I do have the bits. I think I stole these from Sean. But I have another idea. I have the top of this Sororitas Rhino, and I really like the look of these fancy hinges. I bet it'll be easy enough to get rid of the fleur-de-lis. I started out dremeling off the raised part of the symbol, then I used a coarse sanding twig, available from EonsOfBattle.com, to continue getting rid of this shape. Now the best method for gap filling would be to squish down some milliput, let it dry completely, and then sand it. But I am very impatient, so I poured on some UV cure resin. Then I used a toothpick to work this into the gaps, and then I blasted it with my UV lamp. This is much less precise, but it is basically instantaneous. Once that was dry, I used a sanding disc on my Dremel to quickly knock down the high spots, and then I put on some Tamiya Basic Putty in the low spots, anything that the UV resin missed. This is a weird looking thing, it's basically a 40k Rorschach test. Once that was dry, I gave it another sanding, and I can no longer see with the naked eye if it's perfect or not. So I primed it in black. Having all these different materials blacked out, I can now see the remaining imperfections. So one more round of Tamiya Putty. This turned out to be a ton of work, but I do like it. Continuing with my Rhino surgery, I clipped off the smokestacks. These are a little on the dinky side, so I want to build something bigger and better. I took 2 sizes of plastic tubes, one that fits inside the other, and I want to drill some holes. But to make them consistent, I'm gonna have to build a jig. I took one of my wooden paint handles and I made a dent with a screwdriver. Then I drilled a hole big enough for the tube to fit through. Then I drilled a smaller hole from above, going straight through my plastic tube. I made myself marks equal distant from one another, and I made some more holes straight through the block. This will let me make the same holes again and again right through the plastic. I inserted my tube and then drilled the first pass. I made marks so I can line up the tube, flipped it 90 degrees, and then I did it again. The jig is keeping everything right on target. I used this reamer bit in my Dremel to clean up my holes, and then I gave them a quick sand to deburr them, and now I have my own smokestacks. With the jig, I can make as many of these as I want. Then I took the bigger diameter pipe and I cut off some cups that I can slide on over my stacks with a little plastic glue. I sanded the big side of these flat, and for the top, because these are Death Guard Rhinos, I want them broken. I ripped them up with my hobby nippers and I gave them a flash under my heat gun, then I used the butt of a paintbrush to open up the end. I don't know how long it's been since this Death Guard Rhino has been serviced. I glued these down in place and now my Rhino is looking unique. And speaking of unique, I grabbed my random bits bag. This is a bunch of old 40k parts and I found some Chaos vehicle bits. I love this front spike thing. It makes the business end look extra aggressive. And to make sure I never snap it off mid-game, I pinned it with some 1mm brass rod. Then I put the Chaos icons right over where I used to have some filthy loyalist marks, and I found these big ol' hooks that I attached to the back of the treads. This Rhino can now tow stuff. It's really transforming, but I feel like the transformation is not gone far enough. I'm a little nervous, but I feel like it needs even more distressing. I put a ball grinding bit into my Dremel and I began putting little dimples all over the Rhino, being random, some big, some small, just letting the tool make some little scoops. I feel like this will either look really good or like a golf ball. Once I had these dents all over, I gave the dimples a light sanding to knock off any burrs. Then I took my hobby knife and I gouged all the edges, cutting off little triangles to make the armor look even more battle damaged. A nice sharp blade let me really blast through the plastic. Then for some more bits, I attached a big light from the Vindicator kit onto one side and I put a smokestack on the other. The decay of this Rhino is going smoothly. Now I have got this thing pretty well mangled, and it's a little sad, or maybe sad's the wrong word, but bittersweet, to see the Black Templars Rhino that I've known and loved over the years disappear and be replaced by chaotic goodness. But the way I choose to look at it is, boy oh boy, am I getting my money's worth out of this 12-buck Rhino. 10 years ago, I got to have the fun of putting this together on my mom's kitchen table, and now, a decade later, I get to have even more fun of turning it into this. There's a lot of history in this old Black Templars chauffeur, but I know that history. I have experienced that history. Now I get to look forward to making new memories as a Death Guard player. And speaking of new, to turn this into a Death Guard's Rhino, Chaos Rhinos can actually take kind of a lot of guns, and I don't own any of them. So I'm gonna have to get pretty creative if I want this thing WYSIWYG. I have these old plastic Death Guard models, and I think their smaller size will look extra appropriate on the vehicle, because Rhinos are actually way smaller than they should be. So if I want someone peeking out the top, a modern Plague Marine would be too big. I hacked off all the limbs and his backpack, I just need the torso. He's just a little stump, but that stump is really going to tie the whole Rhino together. He'll be manning the combi bolter. I grabbed the turret arms off the old Rhino vehicle sprue, and I glued these onto my boy. I actually had to pinch these a little because he's so small. Then I gave him some Chaos Space Marine shoulder pads to replace the ones I destroyed. Now to give him a weapon. Combi bolters are two regular bolters literally taped together. Luckily, I have tons of Death Guard sprues with Plague Marine bolters still attached. I clipped off a couple of these, drilled out the gun barrels, and then nipped off the handguards. I sanded them smooth on one side and then slapped them together. Not only is this a proper combi bolter, but a combi plague bolter. I found a Rhino ring and I stuck on my Plague Marine with some green stuff, and the real combi bolter connection was too big, so instead I used a piece of sprue and a ball of green stuff to stick it down into place. I think it's pretty convincing, and I really like that one of the barrels has a bayonet. I bet he's doing a lot of stabbing. On the other hatch, I closed it off with these Chaos Vehicle doors. I think these are meant to go in another Rhino ring, but I don't have another one, and I think it looks good just slapped over the hole. Now the last thing is a Havoc launcher, and I don't have one of these. I do have a Hunter Killer missile, but it doesn't feel right, it's the wrong weapon. I went digging through all of my sprues to find something better. I think this will work, the missile launcher from the Sentinel kit. This has multiple rocket pods, just like the Havoc launcher, and I think it'll be perfect. To get it attached, I found the shoulder of a Knight Armiger that just so happens to fit if I shove it in hard enough. I clipped it on an angle, and then to decorate it and make it more chaosy, I found another Chaos Star and I bent it around the handle of my hobby knife, then plastic glued it over the round body of the launcher. I gave it a pin and drilled a hole into the side of my Rhino, but I'm not going to permanently glue it down yet. I think leaving it free will help the painting. I gave it a final look, and I really like the script work I did on the front, and I think I want to do a little something to remember this detail. I took some very thin plastic card and cut myself two little scroll-shaped pieces, rolling them to work in some wrinkles. Then I bent one side over like the paper is folding in on itself, and I cut some little rips and tears into the paper. I glued these down onto my Rhino with some super glue, and to make them a little bit more believably stuck down, I used some sewing pins as nails, and I have them hammered through the paper, permanently trapping down these prayers. Or in the Death Guard's case, some plague recipes for the front of my Rhino. Look at this beast, it's almost unrecognizable. For the first time in its life, this little Rhino is actually done. It's WYSIWYG. The Rhino, not the most exciting thing in 40k, but the Death Guard probably do it the best. Number 1, Movement 12, which you love to see for Death Guard, which is a very, very slow army. Movement 12 is unheard of, and so it is very, very nice to get that in a transport. But also, this has the Gift of Nurgle, the army ability for Death Guard, and it spreads the contagion just as good as anything. If this little Rhino can get within 3, 6, or 9 inches of my opponent, depending on what turn it is, then my opponent is going to be -1 to their save characteristic or -1 to their attacks. Both really, really solid options. I think I'd probably go with the save characteristic most of the time, but sometimes that -1 to be hit is going to be super important. And in addition, this little Rhino has a really spicy ability on its datasheet, Fire Support. If my little Death Guards have gotten out of the Rhino, whatever the Rhino chose to shoot at, the guys who just hopped out are going to get re-roll wounds against that same target. Incredible. Nice, simple, to the point, and it makes the Rhino so much more important and so much more impactful. All of my little Death Guard guys with their weird little vomit guns getting re-roll wounds, that is really, really spicy and a really solid rule to make the Rhino that much more exciting. And speaking of exciting, it is time to get a little Death Guard paint on this sucker and see what he looks like. I primed the model in black and then gave the model a zenithal of white ink from above. Since it's a big brick, I used the white to lay down some value, hitting some spots harder than others. Then I broke out my Death Guard colors. These are from an old discontinued line of paint, but I've been using them exclusively on my guys, just to give them a weird psychedelic scheme. These paints aren't particularly special, it's just a limited palette I like to use. Because I have so much room to fill, I started off dusting the whole Rhino in yellow, dusting this on to tint the white zenithal into a yucky yellow color. Then I made up a brown, mixing some of my blue, red, brown, and black wash together, and I sprayed this over any of the black still showing through. After that, I prepped my palette. A transparent green, a piggy pink, a mustard yellow, a transparent blue, a rusty red, and I always add black and white so I can really play with the value of these colors. Then I put them onto my mini. There isn't really a strategy, I just slobbered it on and then fix it from here. I made up a brown and I painted this into the recesses. This wasn't as dark as I wanted, so I made up a darker brown and I painted this right in the seam between the panels. Now I have my darks taken care of, I switched to a light color and I painted this around the edges. I really like the contrast between the light next to the dark, and I pushed these even further with edge highlights of white, doing a scratchy stipply motion to start a texture. I mixed my yellow and brown together to get an orange, and I started laying on some transitionary layers in between the brown and white. And I did the same thing with my yellow, glazing this over my layers, thin enough to let the previous colors show through, just softening them a little. I'm only focusing on this front section, playing around with my colors and layers to see what happens. I strengthened the corners and details with some glazing of brown, and I used some more orange to edge highlight the details of the door hatch. I'm really liking how the yellow, orange, and brown are working together, and as a final edit, I glazed some transparent green over top to tint my colors. This also pools in the divots, sticking around stronger in some places. All this testing and experimenting has taught me how good the yellow can look, and now I can attack the model with some experience. I switched to a big messy brush and started slapping down my colors over the front of the model, working quickly to lay down my colors and then wet blending them while they're still wet. I stippled on some more white paint onto my wet yellow and I blended it in with a clean brush. This wet blending has taken a fraction of the time it took to actually figure out this recipe. After a glazing of green, the front section is looking just like the top. And for the symbols, I started off sketching on my shadows with a brown, then using my rusty colors for the midtones, then I mixed some white into my orange to make a highlight color that is a little different from the light yellow on the rest of the model. A little more glazing of green, and then some more precise highlights and specular highlights, and the front of my Rhino is looking sharp. I had a thought to make little oil drippies coming out of the viewports of the Rhino. I used a nice sharp brush to make little lines, and just like that, I have some progress on my crazy colors. I've got this Rhino about 25% done, and because of my Death Guard recipe, or it's not so much a recipe as it is a toolbox, it's 5 colors plus black and white. Because of this limited palette, I can't be as literal with the painting. All the metal bits become gunmetal, all of the armor becomes red, the under armor gets something else, wash, weathering. I can't really do my usual tricks, and so everything just has to get discovered. I put down a color and then see how it looks, and then I can manipulate that color by lightening it, darkening it, adding in other colors. And I really like how it looks. I painted a ton of different models in my Death Guard scheme, and I always find things that I wouldn't have found normally. That I painted the heck out of that hatch. And if I wasn't doing my Death Guard scheme, probably would have just thrown a color on there, put a wash on and called it a day. But I really like that little hatch. It's all about the experimenting. And so far, I've only been experimenting with the color yellow. I think it's about time to try some other colors. I'm leaving behind the yellow and making a new problem for myself to figure out. I covered my Rhino's button brown, just slobbering this all over the back and the left-hand side. Then I grabbed my orangey color and started layering on some sort of edge highlighty things, framing each panel with orange. Then I mixed the green and black wash together to darken the center of each panel. It doesn't look good, but I bet I can get somewhere interesting. I mixed up some transitionary colors and started layering these on to smooth out my blends. And I used my rusty brown to start doing some edge highlights, starting out fat and then making them smaller and narrower as they get closer to the edge. Where the brown meets the yellow, I made a light orangey transition, wet blending some yellow into it and mixing the colors together on the model. It's starting to look more purposeful. I kept my edge highlights going, mixing in some more yellow to brighten these up, and I pulled my orange further onto the panels to lighten them. This was a lot of back and forth, but now I'm through the ugly phase and it feels like every brush load is making the model look better. And just like on the yellow, I did a glazing of green to pool in all my little golf dents. These dents gave me an idea. I started dripping some of my orange into them, which looks good on the brown side, and I can continue this onto the yellow as well, a detail that spreads between the two different colors. I used this brown palette on the smokestacks too, doing a little sponging of yellow on the top to get a texture, and then glazing my green mixed with white to get some verdigris. I'm happy for this Rhino to be more yellow and brown. Maybe on another one I'll hit them harder with the greens and blues, but for now I'm going to switch to the decorations. Base coating these in gray and then using my browns as a glaze to darken the recesses. Then I started highlighting, mixing white into my gray mix and then doing some edge highlights. I don't know if this old bit has ever been so carefully painted, but it's really helping hide the age. I glazed on some browns, blues, and greens to work the colors from the hull onto these decorations, and I'm liking how it's looking. Now for those parchments. I base coated these in white, doing a few coats to make them nice, and then I glazed on some white and brown over the low spots. Now it's time to do the script work. I put on 3 dots in a little box, some kind of a nurgly illustration. Then I started dragging my brush in horizontal lines to make the script. Letting my fingers tremble slightly and picking up the brush occasionally helps to make some nice scale text, and keeping the paint very watery so it flows easily off my bristles. I really like how the paper turned out. And now it's time to play around with some more of my blues. I used these on all the lights, base coating them in blue, and then mixing in some white to make lighter colors, and I kept applying this in smaller sections until the lamps were looking good. And the blue only showing up on these makes them stand out even more. For the treads, I kinda like how the base coat brown and the paint spillages turned out. So I just did a little bit of dry brushing with yellow, and then I soaked these in green. This is also a nice instance of the green used sparingly, so that it's even more impactful going on strong on these treads. That is a Rhino. I could not have guessed that it would look like this, and that is how my Death Guard are, just messing around until it's done. That is a spicy Rhino. I glued the hatch on before I checked if there was any loose plastic inside, and now, forever and always, there will be a little rattle coming from this Rhino. But I am excited. And the thing that has got me excited about this Rhino is the humble Plague Marine. The Plague Marines are a Swiss Army knife of a 40k unit. They can take almost anything from the Death Guard Codex. The way I like to outfit my Plague Marines is... we got the Sergeant with the Power Fist and full-size plasma gun, then we got another plasma gun, then we got the Blight Launcher, then we got the Plague Spewer, then we got the Heavy Plague Weapon, and then we got the attached Malignant Plague Caster, firing with the Plague Winds with the focused Witchfire profile. All of that hopping out of a Rhino, sustained hits on all the shots, re-rolling wounds. That is just silly. By the way, all of that, 6 models, double it to 12 the transport capacity of the Rhino. You can put it all in the same Rhino for absolute absurdity. It's gonna take such a long time to roll all of those unique shots, but it's gonna be worth it. I really like that the Death Guard is making normal things like the Rhino and the Plague Marines really, really cool. Now my Rhino is almost done. The last thing, the weapons. Finally, I get to paint an actual guy, and I get to paint him with the same technique, just on a smaller scale. I started off glazing yellow over half of him and then wet blending on some orange and brown. While that was drying, I jumped to the other side, glazing my greens over the zenithal. Then back to the yellow. I started highlighting, painting some light yellow onto the high spots, and then slobbering the recesses in brown. Coming back in and cleaning it up with these sections with some more highlights of yellow. I added more layers to smooth over the blends, and I mixed white into my yellow, applying these like an edge highlight. I glazed green into the recesses of the yellow armor, and I dripped some of my reddish brown to turn the rivets rusty. Then I did some more edge highlights of almost pure white. I want some intense contrast from black to saturated color to white. I want the whole color spectrum. And you know what has every color? That's right, our website. On EonsOfBattle.com, we have all kinds of hobby goodies, Grey Tide studio bits to spice up your Space Marines, Army Painter paints, brushes, base and cork, and we got glue. Ultra thin and ultra thick super glue. And we have terrain. It's the best way to support us doing what we do by getting a membership. Each month, members get a credit good for any one train pack we've ever made or the brand new one. New in March, we have created the Creeping Forest, a collection of mysterious living creatures that can populate a board perfectly for any fantastical war game. Weave your models in between the scuttling crab trees, and you'd better watch your step or you'll get bit by the timber mimics. As you wander through a forest of monstrous mushrooms dripping with colorful toxins, you might come across the Land Kraken, a master of camouflage and a very dangerous encounter. This wondrous terrain collection was invented by us and is available physically and as STL from EonsOfBattle.com. I did the same thing, switching to blues and greens for his other side, working up through layers of highlights and then using my browns to glaze in some rust. Now my Plague Marine is looking good, it's time for the weapons. I want to follow the same grays I used on the tank accessories. First I carefully painted around the handle of my Marine with black, and then I coated the bolter with 2 coats of black wash. Then I started highlighting up with gray and edge highlights a light gray. And for the socket, I was planning on yellow, but I think rusty brown will do a better job separating my yellow Marine from the yellow hull. I applied a few layers of edge highlights and then glued my Marine into place permanently. This tank is almost done, just the Havoc launcher next. Since this is going on the yellow side, I'm gonna paint it in yellow, slobber in browns and grays over the techie bits, and then a black wash over the gun. Then I brightened up the yellow towards the top of the launcher, and I edge highlighted the business end with the same grays I mixed up for the combi bolter. Then I glued it down permanently, and this Rhino is done again. That is a Death Guard Rhino. Oh, I am pleased with this. Underneath all of that new paint is one of my old Black Templars Rhinos, but now, I mean, if High School Jay could see what this Rhino would one day become, this is really cool. And no matter how long I keep this as a Death Guard Rhino, I will always know that it began life as a Black Templars Rhino because I glued the back door on backwards. I'm really glad that I went with the Sororitas doors because I feel like it really ties the whole Rhino together. Also, leaving the side doors off, I feel like looks so much better than with the doors on. I mean, this thing is basically a brick. It needs all the help it can to look interesting, and I feel like the sunken doors do look really interesting. And I was definitely nervous after drilling all of those little dimples all over the hull, but now that it's painted up, I really think they look nice. Not only is this Rhino secretly an antique, but I got to use up so many of my bits. To put together some more Death Guard Rhinos, I'll probably have to buy the actual parts on eBay, but for this guy, I mean, he's got the old school plastic Plague Marine up top. He's got Sentinel guns. He's got Sororitas parts. I don't know where this spiked grill came from. I think maybe the Defiler kit. I think I got it from Adepticon. I bought a bucket of bits, and I think that's where this came from, but man, this is a monstrous, disgusting looking Death Guard Rhino, and it has got me really excited to finally finish my Death Guard. It has been years and years and years, and honestly, I have 2,000 points. It's just the wrong 2,000 points. Like, I have basically no infantry put together. I don't have any Terminators. I've just got a bunch of weird vehicles. But the Death Guard look really cool with their vehicles. I am really excited to return this Rhino to the collection in its new incarnation. And I got 5 more. So I got plenty more fodder to turn into some new chaotic vehicles. Thanks for watching.